While this race has largely been reduced to a contest of whether voters nationwide want Republicans to take back the Senate or Democrats to maintain their majority, what do Pennsylvanians actually want? What don't people outside of Pennsylvania know about the priorities of what Pennsylvania voters want out of their next U.S. senator?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about Pennsylvania from people who don't live in the state, much like any state, I think. I think
Yeah.
unless you live in that state and you understand the dynamics, I think it's hard to understand the politics. But Pennsylvania is essentially Pittsburgh and Philadelphia with Kentucky or Alabama in the middle. You have extremely rural areas, people who just want to be left alone, very, very libertarian, very, very, very conservative beliefs that don't want the government infringing upon their life. And then you have in Philly and Pittsburgh, more so in Philly, just because it's so massive, you have more of that urban voter that they're pretty much gonna vote Democrat no matter what. Now, what really swings this state, yes, it's the independent voters, but I think a piece of that, where a lot of those independent voters are, or a lot of those voters who they might be registered Democrat, but swing back and forth and vote Republican sometimes, you have it in the belts around Pittsburgh and around Philadelphia of suburbia. And what you had in 2016, you had a lot of those suburbs, a lot of those areas go for Donald Trump. In 2020, you had a lot of those areas go for Joe Biden. And what it's going to come down to, I think, is inflation. I think everybody's talking about inflation. Even people on the left are starting to stop their denial of inflation being a real thing because they're noticing there's not as much money in my bank. What is happening here? Then they start looking at the money that's going out and how much they're spending and everything. A couple of the other things, abortion, obviously, that's a piece. Democrats have been hammering that. I don't think that's going to, it's when they rank issues, it's like normally coming in like 2 or 3, but it's going to be important. Abortion is important to a lot of people, for Democrats to protect that right, and of course for Republicans to keep that at the state level and not have a federal, some sort of federal monstrosity go through regulating abortion. But I think really the one thing that a lot of people aren't looking at that will have a big impact on this election is children and their education. And if, we want them to be forcibly vaccinated with the COVID vaccine, that's something that's really not being talked about. And I think that will sway a lot of soccer moms voting. We've seen recently, I think it was in Michigan with Gretchen Whitmer, who was her opponent Dixon. I forget her first name.
Tudor. Yeah.
Is it Tudor Dixon?
Yeah,
I think it's
Tudor
Tudor
Dixon.
Dixon.
Yeah.
She was citing a constituent that she talked to, a Muslim guy who really was talking about, I've been a Democrat my whole life, but because of what's happening in the schools, and then bringing sex into the schools, teaching kindergartners about transgenderism and sex education, I'm voting Republican. All of my Muslim friends are voting Republican. That same thing, not necessarily with the religious background, but that same thing with conservative soccer moms who might not be conservative in that they're going to vote Republican, but conservative in that they don't want their children in kindergarten or first grade learning about sex. They're going to vote Republican to protect their kids. When you put kids on the ballot, that's going to change a lot of votes and change how people vote. And we'll talk about predictions in a minute, but I'll hold off without saying anything else at this point, I guess.